Still, Robert was not without cunning. After weeks of deliberation, he decided to send secret messages to Storm's End and to certain loyal bannermen of the Stormlands, men who had always favored House Baratheon. The letters were drafted in his own hand, referencing personal details that only the true Robert could know. He wrote of their shared battles during the rebellion, of hunts they had once enjoyed, or of slights and jokes that an impostor would never guess. He sealed them with an improvised signet ring, a simple piece of metal on which he carved the stag sigil, heated and pressed into hot wax to form a rudimentary seal. The letters would travel through a chain of trusted messengers, hopefully evading Lannister eyes. If even a fraction of the recipients believed in him, that might form the core of the army he needed. By the time the year turned, rumors of a restless spirit in King's Landing abounded. The whispers spoke of a vengeful ghost, of King Robert's specter prowling the alleyways at night, seeking to punish those who had betrayed him. Some said they had seen a tall figure in a cloak, brandishing a warhammer carved with a stag's head, vanish into the darkness after dealing savage blows to Lannister soldiers. Indeed, Robert did take it upon himself to mete out punishment where he could, prowling the alleys with 2 or 3 of his new companions. If they came upon a lone Lannister guard who harassed a woman or extorted coin from a shopkeeper, Robert would set upon them with a fury that was terrifying to behold. He was not as strong as he once had been in his prime, but the strange fire in his blood lent him stamina. He moved with a single-minded purpose, recalling the thrill of violence from his youth. Each time he swung his hammer, he felt the ghost of Rhaegar's skull caving in. When they left the guard broken on the cobblestones, Robert moved on without pity. This was war, and he had learned how to kill a long time ago. Such clandestine raids did not go unnoticed by the powers in the Red Keep. Joffrey, Cersei, and the council heard tales of a shadowy figure who called himself King Robert. The Gold Cloaks were instructed to hunt him down, to quell these rumors with swift brutality. Anyone caught speaking of the resurrected Robert Baratheon could be charged with treason. The tension in the city grew thick enough to be felt at every corner. Yet the small folk had grown weary of the Lannisters, and stories of the old king's rough charm and generosity still lingered, overshadowing the memories of his rages. More and more, they began to speak of him as a possible savior, a man come back from the grave to deliver them from Joffrey's cruelty. The Lannisters found themselves quashing these rumors at every turn, but the seeds had been planted, and they sprouted in the darkness no matter what new outrages were enacted. At last, Robert's letters bore fruit. One night, a small band of men wearing cloaks with the sigil of House Cairn of Nightsong slipped into the city, delivering a sealed message to the appointed contact. It stated that they had come by the secret bidding of the new Lord Cairn, who had been a boy during the rebellion but remembered Robert as a friend of his father. They wished to behold this living king with their own eyes. If convinced, they might carry word back to the Stormlands, rallying more forces. Meeting them was a risky endeavor. The Lannisters had eyes everywhere, and Tywin's cunning was not to be underestimated. But Robert could not pass up the chance. So, on another night thick with darkness, he convened with them in a hidden courtyard near the Dragon Pit. The Red Priestess was with him, as were 6 of his most trusted men. When the Stormlanders arrived, they did so with weapons hidden under their cloaks, clearly prepared for treachery. Robert stepped forward, drawing back his hood. The torchlight revealed his face, gaunt and intense, the black hair streaked with white at the temples. His beard had grown out in an unruly fashion, but his features were unmistakable to those who had studied his youthful portraits or remembered him in the prime of the rebellion. The swirl of rumors was one thing. To see his eyes, fierce and alive, was another. They knelt, though one of their number, a grizzled knight, stared long and hard at him, doubt etched on his face. "By the 7, he murmured. "It is him." Robert placed a hand on the man's shoulder, urging him to stand. He spoke in a low voice. "I know this is difficult to believe, but I am he, your king. I have returned." He could see the awe in their eyes, mixed with trepidation, as though they were unsure if they should fear him or praise him. "Return to your lord," Robert said. "Tell him the truth of what you have seen. The Lannisters are usurpers, and that bastard boy on the throne is not of my blood. I mean to reclaim what is mine and punish all who conspired to kill my friend, Eddard Stark." One of the younger men, presumably a squire, spoke up bravely. "What of Stannis, your grace? Will you oppose him as well?" Robert paused, feeling an odd swirl of emotion. He had loved Stannis once, albeit from a certain distance. He knew Stannis was a hard man, but he was also just. Then again, Stannis had permitted Ned's death. Had he? Or had he? Robert lacked the details. He only knew that Stannis had allied with another Red Priestess, one who seemingly used dark powers to murder Renly. Another brother lost, in a sense. "I will deal with Stannis in time," he replied firmly, unwilling to show uncertainty before these men. "But for now, the greatest threat to the realm is the Lannister stranglehold on King's Landing. If Stannis remains in open rebellion, then we shall have to settle that once the false king is undone. But rest assured, I have no love for bloodshed between Baratheons. I would see this realm at peace under my rightful rule." A hush fell. The Stormlanders exchanged glances, each seeming to measure Robert's words. Then they nodded in unison. The older knight spoke again. "We shall carry your message, your grace. Expect word when the time is right." With that, they departed, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as they had come. That was all Robert could do: sow seeds of rebellion among those who might yet be loyal. In the following weeks, the tension in King's Landing rose to a fever pitch. The Gold Cloaks began rounding up suspected traitors. The rumor of King Robert's resurrection had reached the Red Keep in full, and Joffrey was furious. He raged in the throne room, demanding the head of this impostor, swearing vile punishments on anyone caught spreading the rumor. Cersei, always cunning, advised him to keep calm and let the rumor burn itself out. She likely did not truly believe that Robert had returned. To her, it had to be a trick or an opportunist with a passing resemblance. But she had grown uneasy, remembering well Robert's final days and how vehemently he had begun to question Joffrey's parentage. She tightened her hold on the city guard and ordered increased patrols. Tywin Lannister took a more measured approach. He quietly commanded his spies to investigate the sightings, while simultaneously preparing to crush any mass uprising. He did not believe in miracles, but neither was he foolish enough to dismiss the chance that some new challenger might be raising a rebellion using Robert's memory. The slightest spark, he knew, could ignite a firestorm in a city as volatile as King's Landing. A cold wind from the north began to blow, reminiscent of winter's creeping approach. Supply lines were strained, and the small folk struggled to keep warm. Many nights, fights would break out over scraps of food. The chaos made it easier for Robert's network to move, but also riskier, as more gold cloaks roamed the streets. The Red Priestess employed her illusions when necessary, bending shadows around Robert so that prying eyes would pass him by. She seemed tireless, as though the Lord of Light fueled her every breath. Sometimes Robert wondered if she was even human at all, or some fiery apparition in mortal flesh. Yet she was always gentle with him, offering guidance in a voice that suggested unshakable faith. Meanwhile, Robert's hammer blows against solitary Lannister patrols became less frequent. He saved his anger for the day he might face them in open battle. Instead, he listened closely to the priestess, heeding her counsel of patience. In the nights when he could not sleep, he paced the cramped cellar and imagined how he would meet Joffrey face to face. He could almost taste the moment, the shock in that arrogant boy's eyes. Joffrey had sentenced Ned to death as though it were a game. Robert seethed, determined to show him the brutal consequence of that decision. At last, word arrived from the Stormlands. In the belly of a merchant ship that slipped into Blackwater Bay under the cover of darkness, a courier emerged, carrying a sealed scroll. Robert met with him in a hidden corner of the docks, accompanied by the priestess and 3 loyal men. The courier was a dark-haired youth with a serious face, wearing plain clothing that bore no sigils. He handed Robert the scroll, which bore a black wax seal with the faint impression of a nightingale. Robert broke the seal and read by the lantern's glow. His heart pounded as he saw the names of several houses listed. Karen, Penrose, Grandison, and others. They had quietly pledged to rally their levies, waiting only for Robert's signal. They had only a fraction of the manpower they might have possessed in peacetime, as the wars had consumed resources, but it was still a formidable corps. Moreover, some of the Storm Lords not explicitly allied in the letter might be swayed once they witnessed Robert's living presence. The letter also carried cautionary notes. Joffrey's hold on King's Landing was strong, and the Tyrell alliance gave him additional manpower. A direct assault might end in slaughter if not timed properly or if not supplemented by further alliances. Robert understood. He needed one more advantage, a blow that would set the city to revolt from within. He considered the small folks' misery, how close they were to open rebellion. Perhaps, if he could undermine Joffrey's authority at a critical moment, if the gold cloaks turned cloaks or if the people rose up, the gates might be opened from the inside. Then the Stormlanders could pour in. But that would require cunning, persuasion, or sabotage. The Red Priestess, sensing his turmoil, touched his shoulder. "Take heart, my king. You are not alone in this endeavor. The flames guide us." In that moment, Robert realized that no matter how miraculous his return, victory was far from guaranteed. He was a single man, tested by death itself, reliant on the unknown fortunes of a foreign god. He closed his eyes, inhaling the salt air that wafted in from Blackwater Bay, heavy with the smell of fish and rotting seaweed. How different this was from the triumphant days of the rebellion. Then, he had been unstoppable in his rage, carrying all before him. Now he was forced to skulk through shadows, forging alliances in secret. But the end would justify the means. If he could free the realm from the Lannister yoke and avenge Ned, he would do whatever it took. In the weeks that followed, the plan began to take shape. Robert's co-conspirators in the city quietly stockpiled weapons and organized small cells of resistance. The priestess worked to further conceal their activities, employing illusions and, at times, whispered prayers that seemed to confuse the Lannister men at critical junctures. Robert took to wearing partial armor concealed beneath his robes, just enough to guard his torso in case of a sudden confrontation. He also, to the surprise of his men, tried to cut back on the wine. Though he still drank for fortitude, he recognized that the time for revelry was past. The realm needed a king who could act swiftly, not a drunkard who stumbled from one banquet to the next. One of the greatest dangers was the King's Landing spy network, particularly the eyes and ears of Varys, the master of whisperers, though rumors suggested he had fled. Or perhaps Qyburn, a new arrival, was taking up the network. Robert had never fully understood the intricacies of the spider's web of informants, but he knew better than to underestimate it. So the priestess taught him basic incantations of misdirection, short prayers to Lawler that, when spoken in High Valyrian, seemed to distort the perceptions of those near him. Robert was initially skeptical, for he had never been a pious man. But the first time he witnessed a gold cloak walk right past him without seeming to notice his presence, he realized the power was real. Still, the day of open war was coming, and no illusions would hold an entire army at bay. Letters flew back and forth between Robert's hidden base and the Stormlands. Additional messages were sent north, though it was unclear how the king in the north, Robb Stark, would react. That boy might despise Robert for failing to save Ned. Yet perhaps, if he learned that Robert planned to avenge Ned, he might offer some measure of support. Robert hoped that the memory of the ancient Baratheon Stark friendship, forged in the rebellion, would not be entirely dead. All the while, the city simmered, on the brink of boiling over. Joffrey's cruelties grew more frequent. Public floggings for minor offenses, the rounding up of beggars, the execution of any who were caught speaking seditious words. The small folk glared at the Red Keep with hungry, hateful eyes. The gold cloaks patrolled in larger bands now, but they could not be everywhere. Robert's men seized every chance to fan the flames of unrest. A rumor that Joffrey had insulted the father or the mother. A whisper that the grain stores in the castle were full while children starved. Fury and desperation made for a potent brew, and day by day, that brew grew stronger. Finally, the sign came. One of Robert's agents, who served in the royal kitchens, brought word of a grand feast to be held in the Red Keep, supposedly in celebration of a new alliance with some minor house from the Reach. Many of the city's dignitaries would attend, along with Lannister loyalists. The gold cloaks would be spread thin, assigned to guard the castle's gates and the roads leading to it. Meanwhile, the Stormlanders had sent word that they were poised to strike, having mustered a respectable force near Tumbleton. If Robert could incite the city to uprising on the night of the feast, and if the gates could be opened, the Stormlanders would ride in under cover of darkness, bolstered by the confusion. The plan was as perilous as it was bold. Everything would hinge on perfect timing. Robert gathered his closest companions in the musty cellar that had become their headquarters. He laid out the plan in a low, commanding voice, the flicker of torchlight reflecting in his eyes. The men listened with unwavering attention, for none could deny the gravity of what they were about to do. If they succeeded, they would topple a regime. If they failed, they would all be executed. Robert divided them into groups. Some would lead portions of the small folk in a riot, stirring them with outrage at how the Lannisters feasted while children starved. They would set fires in the streets near the Red Keep, forcing the gold cloaks to scramble. Another group would infiltrate a section of the city wall that was lightly guarded, using a hidden sally port to let the Stormlanders in. Robert, accompanied by the Red Priestess and a select few, would make his way into the Red Keep itself, slipping through an entrance known to him from his reign, an old servant's passage that he had once used for drunken escapades. They would confront Joffrey, Cersei, and as many of the Lannisters as they could. Once the Stormlanders flooded the city, the gold cloaks might capitulate, especially if they saw their king, alive and vengeful, leading the charge. The day before the feast, Robert scarcely slept. He prayed, haltingly, to the Lord of Light for victory, though he still found the act foreign. He thought of Lyanna Stark in those final hours, that memory of her death that had once driven him to vengeance against the Targaryens. He thought of Ned, the loyal friend who had stood by him from the beginning, only to be forsaken in a moment of political treachery. He thought of all he had lost, his youth, his illusions, his very life. And now, here he stood on the brink of a second war for the throne. The fear and excitement mingled in his blood, making his heart throb like a drum. The evening of the feast arrived. The sky over King's Landing stained red and purple with the dusk. Outside the Red Keep, lanterns were lit in celebration. Inside, lords and ladies gathered in the great hall, the air thick with the smell of roasted meats and freshly baked bread. Musicians played sprightly tunes while Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, a smug grin on his face. Cersei hovered near him, her eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of threat. Lannister guards stood at key points, their crimson cloaks vibrant in the torchlight. In the city below, tension crackled through the winding streets. The small folk glanced around warily, anticipating something. The gold cloaks were on high alert, but many had been diverted to the Red Keep or to the gates. On a signal known only to Robert's network, small knots of men and women began to gather in the squares. They carried torches, farm tools, whatever weapons they could find. Fueled by anger and desperation, they shouted curses against the Lannisters and the boy king. Someone overturned a cart, blocking a side street. Another group lit a bale of hay on fire. The chaos began to spread, slow at first, then rapidly. Within minutes, the city was ablaze with riot. Gold cloaks tried to contain the crowds, but they were outnumbered. Shouts of "King Robert lives!" punctuated the roar of the masses, echoing off stone walls. The swirling confusion gave cover to the infiltration teams that slipped to the edges of the city walls. At one of the quieter sections, near the mud gate, Robert's loyal men surprised the few guards on duty, dispatching them quickly. They pried open a rusted sally port, allowing in a contingent of Stormlander knights, their armor marked discreetly with the stag sigil. The knights fanned out, forming a wedge and moving to secure a path through the city. Meanwhile, Robert and the Red Priestess were part of a small group moving toward the Red Keep. Clad in dark robes, they navigated the shadows cast by flickering lanterns, crossing the courtyard where the festival atmosphere turned uneasy as the sounds of riot drifted uphill. Guards at the gatehouse scanned the area, uncertain whether to remain in place or join their comrades in the city. The priestess whispered a prayer, and Robert felt a wave of heat pass over him. The guards seemed momentarily dazed, as though their eyes slid away from the group. Moving swiftly, Robert and his men slipped into a side passage. The lower corridors of the Red Keep were scarcely patrolled that night, for the celebration was happening above. Yet word of the riots had begun to reach the castle. Robert could hear distant shouting and the hurried footsteps of servants who sensed danger. He led his group through a maze of passages, recalling from memory the old route he once used. Even in this moment, he could not help but feel a grim smile tug at his lips as he remembered tiptoeing through these halls to avoid Cersei after some drunken escapade. How times had changed.